Hi, I'm Autumn,
And I'm Abby.
and this is The Right Angle, the podcast that's more about the process than perfection.
We're both fantasy lovers and storytellers who like getting into the nitty gritty of creative work.
And today we're tuning into a different kind of storytelling. Literally, we brought on a guest to talk with us about how music composition compares to writing fiction. Adrienne, we are so excited to have you on.
Do you want to introduce yourself and tell listeners a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm Adrienne. I'm a music education major. My two principal instruments are voice and trumpet, and I got involved with composition this semester to work on a project for our university's honors program. I wanted to try composition because I feel that performing music can only take you so far. There is a lot of creativity in the way you express things or the way you interpret already written works, but composition is true creativity in music in its most raw form.
All right, let's start by talking about how music composition and story writing overlap.
Yeah, whether you're working with sentences or staves, there's so much involved in crafting a mood, a structure, and a narrative arc. So, Adrienne, we want to talk a little bit about pacing and building emotion in a song versus story. How do you go about doing that when you're working on a composition piece?
With pacing, I think it has to do with the complexity and the intensity of the music. So a lot of it is knowing where you're starting and knowing where you want your intensity to build up to. How I would do that is I usually work with choir pieces, so layering voices on top of each other and making the harmonies more complex and increasing the dynamics to make it feel more intense.
I feel like that's very comparable to upping the tension and stakes in a story. Kind of that like moment of most impact that you're talking about. I feel like that can be comparable to, a story's climax. I feel like a lot of music and stories kind of follow a similar plot arc that you learn about in elementary school that doesn't quite fit every story, but I feel like a lot of music and a lot of fiction kind of can fit into that upward downward line.
Definitely. And I think something to consider when looking at music versus stories is they both have this concept of theme and motifs in it. Adrienne, do you want to go a little bit into reading and composition and how theme is different in both?
Comes through several times within the piece is how I interpret that. Or it could just be, if you want to call it a vibe, theatrical productions to symbolize like a certain character or a certain thing that happens, and then they will return to that.
Yeah, so going off of that, how do you utilize these themes and motifs, and how do you see that kind of working with how literary themes work?
It's a good question. I think comparing it to writing with themes, you don't really write the same thing. You echo what's already been said, and I think it is kind of similar for writing music. You're not writing the exact same thing. That'd be boring. Your listeners would get bored. I know I would. So you echo it with the context of what you've been writing already. You return to it and you greet it like an old friend. It's not new, but it's in the context, so it feels different than when it started.
So, one thing we want to explore a little bit with you, because it's something that we think of more as literary writers, is this idea of structure. So, how do you think about structure? And how does that look while you're composing?
It's kind of similar to what we were saying earlier with like the point of most impact and that line that they teach you in grade school. So you have to think about in what part of the piece am I when you're looking at the overall piece. And then structure when you get down to the really minute details, like if you guys were to analyze a sentence, you're like, okay, what is this sentence serving for? When you're analyzing your music and trying to get down to like each measure, structure really plays a role in phrases. When writing a musical phrase, there are kind of four parts to it. You start in what we call the tonic, which is the home of the phrase. And then you start to transition with the predominant to the dominant, which is the away is what we like to compare it to. And then you go back to home. So analyzing those phrases really sets you up for success when you're writing the melody for your piece. You have to think about where am I in the small sense and also in the overarching sense of the piece.
And I think that's really comparable to looking at a story arc and where you want your story to go as you're writing it, is looking at the smaller details of where am I now? How am I get this character from one side of the room to the other, versus looking over the whole story arc of seeing, okay, how am I going to get this character to overcome this big major obstacle? Or how am I going to get this character to grow in this way over a longer scheme? And I think that's very comparable.
One thing that I'd like to bring up, I have been told by some of my creative writing faculty that when constructing a scene, you should view that scene as a self-contained story arc. So you should have a goal within that scene, and there should be that point of impact and then the end. And I feel like that's pretty comparable to these musical phrases being smaller arcs within the larger arc. Structurally, I think music and story writing are very similar, and I think that that's super cool.
That is exactly how our professors have explained it to us. I fear.
Now, let's get into how we actually make things. Writing and composing both have these weird winding processes, and they're usually not linear.
Yeah, sometimes the spark comes first. Sometimes you're just chasing a mood or a sound and seeing where it goes. So, one of the first stages is kind of that drafting stage. I want to see, how does that look like for you as a music composer?
For me, research plays a heavy role in my compositions, especially with the piece I'm writing now. It is based on a melody that's already been written. So for the first few weeks that I started composing this piece, I only research. I wrote down where it came from, what are the contexts and the time where it was written, and where I wanted this piece to go, what was its purpose for being written, what kind of overall sound of the piece that I wanted. And then comes the trial and error part where you just kind of throw stuff out onto your sheet music and play through it, and if it's trash, you rewrite it.
I feel like that's a pretty good segue into another thing that I think is comparable between the actual writing process of both fiction and music. What's your relationship with revising? How does that look like for music composition?
You can't compose without revisions. It is quite literally impossible. I have written before, and so I understand wanting to get it right on the first try and being a perfectionist about it and wanting to edit every little punctuation mark that you possibly can. And sometimes that happens with music, but it's almost easier to let yourself write something bad at first and then go back and rewrite it.
I think that is very similar to something me and Abby brought up in a previous episode, this idea of bad writing.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of being okay with that and understanding it is a part of the process, and just sitting in this space of knowing this isn't my best work, but that's okay because no one else has to see it necessarily. And it's all a stepping stone for me to improve upon later.
You learn from it a lot. I know since I'm just starting out with composition, my professor just kind of let me go at it, and then I realized, oh, I need to go back and really look at the small steps before trying to write this whole piece with absolutely nothing.
I find it really interesting how you feel that it's a lot easier to get in this mindset of bad first drafts with music composition as opposed to writing, especially since you're so new to music composition. I'm really glad that that tendency came to you, a lot more naturally, but I find that interesting because I feel like with writing, it takes a long time and a lot of practice and a lot of skill build up for being okay with bad drafting to come as a natural tendency. Do you feel like that it's just a music composition thing for drafting to be a more friendly feeling endeavor?
I think so. I think it seems to be common with all of the composers that I've met and have worked with. It's also just this idea that music is not one thing, sound is not one thing, and it's okay to explore new sounds without judging them as soon as they come out of your fingertips. But I think with writing stories specifically, I know we were all told when we were little, like, oh, you guys are just smart girls, you're gonna go places, and excelled in English class just because, we're semi-decent at it. And so I think that mindset is why it's harder for writing now. But for music composition, I've never even thought of trying it. And so it's a completely new process to me, whereas writing is taught from age 4. So it's a little bit different, but
Yeah. I know we touched on this a little bit earlier where you mentioned your piece is actually inspired by a melody previously, but are there any other sources of inspiration that you found while writing this piece that maybe you had initially or that you've discovered while you're writing?
while writing this piece, it was mainly from that melody is what I've based it on. I've also just found a lot of inspiration as I learn new things in my music theory classes and in sight singing, things that are interesting that I want to incorporate. So for this piece specifically, it's just a lot of intellection. It's an academic exercise more than writing based on a mood. But I definitely wanted it to feel innocent and light and carefree because the reason I chose the melody, it's Lavender's Blue, which is an English broadside. My mom used to sing the lullaby to me when I was really little, and so it has been stuck in my brain ever since, and I've always wanted to write this piece. So I wanted to carry that childhood feeling into the piece.
That's really cool.
I completely agree. Another thing that I think might be comparable between writing and, well, writing music is sometimes there are moments that feel very intuitive, this is the right thing that I'm putting on the page. And then there are some times that are really messy that you just kind of have to fight through, that you look back on and it's like, oh, that actually led to something good. I'm wondering, what does that feel like for music composition?
The intuitive writing is definitely more fun because it feels like it's just flowing out of you, like your soul is made of music and you're getting it out on the page, and it just is a wonderful feeling. And yeah, when you're fighting through the messy parts of it, it's almost disheartening. And I'm betting that some people writing also understand this. It's wondering, am I actually good at this? Because I'm having to fight so hard for this to sound good. But it's almost more rewarding that way. Because you look back on it and you think about all the things that you learned from writing this absolute trash melody, but in the end, you got something that is a labor of love. So both are good in their own ways, I feel.
I feel like you put that so aptly, that all of that was very relatable.
Yeah, and I think that almost kind of leads into my next question, which is about the creative writing block and what it looks like for you specifically, because I know each person and each genre and each type of composition, whether that be writing or musical, it can look very different. So, how does it look different for you? And you can talk about this in your music composition, or you could talk about it in what it also looks like in some of your literary writing, because I know you've dabbled in that a little bit too.
Yeah, they're very different actually. In my literary works, I write a lot of poetry, and creative block doesn't really exist for me in that world because I just write poetry when I feel like it. And so sometimes it'll just be months before I feel something that I need to write about. But with composition, when you are on a deadline and you have to get something good on the page before your lesson next Wednesday, it is a little bit stressful. But writing block for composition usually feels more like a math problem that you can't solve instead of I just don't have any ideas. I think it's because I'm starting out with composition and I'm very new to it. I have millions and millions of ideas locked up in here, but I don't have the means or the knowledge to get them out yet. But I'm learning because my professor is absolutely wonderful. So I guess with composition, I don't really experience creative block. It's just more trying to develop my skill set to put my creative ideas on paper.
That's so interesting because it's weirdly almost the opposite of literary writing in some sense, because a lot of times we have the means to write, we're just out of those ideas, or we're stuck with the internal, where it sounds like you have that internal stuff figured out. It's just the mechanics.
Exactly. Yeah. The mechanics are the issue here for me. Maybe not with every composer. I'm sure that people who write choir works for a living run out of ideas, and then they're just having to copy paste. I've sung a lot of copy paste choir parts.
One thing we both think a lot about as writers is sound. So rhythm, flow, how words hit the ear.
And I mean, music is sound, so we're curious how language and sound overlap for you, especially when it comes to emotion. And I do understand that a lot of your literary writing is poetry, and that kind of blends into some of the lyricism that you do for your choral pieces. How do you think those two interests of yours overlap?
It's hard. I find writing lyrics harder than just writing poetry. Lyrics to me feel very structured. You have to put them in a box and they have to rhyme in this scheme, whereas the poetry I write is very free verse. And so writing lyrics in music is not one of my fortes, which is why this choir piece that I am doing is super nice because it already has the lyrics written out for me and I just have to figure out what to write around it. For as long as I can remember as a listener to music, I have only listened to the sound of music. I could not tell you the lyrics of my favorite song. No idea. But the sound really resonates with me. No pun intended.
Intend that pun.
I intend that fun. The sound has always really made sense to me, which just reaffirms my choice to become a music major. So I think more about conveying whatever I am feeling through sound only, because I feel that's it's almost an otherworldly feeling that you can speak without language. It's something different.
I think one thing that musical composition really has to play with is that idea of silence, and how silence is almost a sound within itself. Do you want to talk a little bit on that?
Silence can almost be more impactful than the actual music. I've heard a lot of pieces where my favorite parts are just this absence in the midst of all this chaos around it. I personally haven't written any pieces that plays with silence yet, but it's a really cool idea to think about.
I know all three of us are musicians, and in the ensemble I'm in right now, our director uses the phrase play the rest because they are just as important and often are impactful. Speaking of impacts, how would you think about using sound as storytelling? I know you were talking about it being this otherworldly thing of being able to convey emotions and meaning without the use of words, which, words are kind of autonomous thing. Do you have some thoughts on that?
You have to be very intentional with everything. In music composition, just like a sentence, you think about every single piece of it. You think about the rests, which are still important. You think about what instruments you have, the timbre of how it's going to sound. And if there are words, like thinking about what those words are going to do to the sound of a note, because vowels change the sound a little bit. Again, there's that idea of where you want to go, and having this story or overarching theme already thought of, you can plan out intentionally what you want to use it for.
I know we talk a little bit about editing and revising and what that looks like for musical composition, but how do you know when your piece is done? How does it feel complete to you?
When I've said all I want to say.
That's really smart. And I think that's something we do in our writing too, is we say it all down in our first draft, and then we go in and we cut it and we revise it and we edit it until it sounds how we want to say it. But with music, it already kind of does sound how you want to say it, in a sense, if that makes any sense.
I mean, one thing my writing mentor told me when I was asking her, well, how do I know if my project's done? She said, well, once you start changing things to the point where you're completely changing what you want your piece to say, then that means you're done and you've found what you want to say, and you're just making changes because you have gotten in the habit of making changes.
I think also when I finish this piece that I'm working on right now, it will feel like saying hello to an old friend, because it has lived in my mind for so long that once it's finally out on the page and I hear it in completion with all of the voices singing what they're supposed to and all the instruments, it will sound from my heart.
Do you think being done with your piece and moving on to it being performed, will that feel more liberating, or do you think it'll feel sad and that you'll miss the process?
I think it will feel more liberating with this one as it's a project with a deadline. So it's a little bit stressful, but I will miss viewing composition with new eyes. Being very new to it, it has given me such a deeper appreciation for music in general and other composers, even pieces I don't like. I can still appreciate the care and craft in them. So I will miss that part of the process, but I will be excited to move on to something new, and you're basically learning a new process all over because every piece is different.
Now, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something which we did not brief with Adrienne beforehand. But we want to talk a little bit more about your literary writing and your poetry writing and how you go about the process, what that looks like for that. Because I know we talked about how you write when you feel like it or when you have something to say. So once you have something to say, do you just word vomit or do you have something in mind of structure you're looking to go for?
Yeah, poetry kind of just comes out of me. It is not planned, it is not great, but that's not the point. The point is to help me process. So if something happens, or I come across a realization or big life changes, usually words will just come to me and eventually I get them down on paper and then away they go into the abyss. And sometimes I go back and edit them if I really like how I said something and I want to just make it a little bit better just for me, but it's not a stressful thing and I don't intend to make it stressful and try and do something with it because it just feels it's very personal.
I think that's a wonderful thing, though. I think there needs to be more just personal writing in this world, people writing just because they enjoy it, whether it's poetry, short stories about dragons, mystery books that they keep under their dresser or in like a Google Doc that they never touch again. It just it like you said, it's a great way to get out what you're feeling, process emotions, just do something that feels fulfilling with your life. And I think even if you don't feel like your process is as perfect or clean as you may picture like professionals, I still think it's a good process, especially because poetry is so different. It is such a varied, odd genre of writing, especially if it's for yourself. But I think that's beautiful.
I think everyone should do it. I view it almost as like my personal journal. I could never in a million years just keep a personal journal that I wrote down what I did every single day. I could never do that. I view this as a journal when I need it.
Nice. I think I have one last question for you, Adrienne, before we wrap up. And that's, what is one similarity that you see between musical composition and literary composition?
I think the mindset needs to be similar. Like we were saying, it needs to be freeing instead of stressful. It needs to reflect who you are as the author. You can't just write for other people. You have to give a part of yourself to it, and it should be a freeing thing. And I think being okay with it being bad at first is very important in both. Letting yourself be bad, letting it be good, letting it be what it needs to be in that moment.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Whether you're composing music or writing a novel, it all comes back to telling a story. One that feels true to you.
And the creative process is messy, emotional, unpredictable, and so worth it.
Thank you again to Adrienne for joining us today. We loved hearing your perspective. Well, that's it from the right angle, where we know the real story is in the process, not the product.
Until next time, write boldly, revise gently, and stay weird.